Okay, so now we're going to talk about lipids. In nutrition, I want you to get familiar with that word lipid. Very often we think about fats and oils, but there are other components to this lipid category that we want to talk about. And there are some different ways in which these kinds of molecules, the lipids, are important in the body. So I'm just going to review that very quickly for you. They are a dramatic source of energy. It's a very convenient storage form in our body. Remember that one molecule of fat is worth 9 calories compared to carbohydrates, which we would store in the form of glycogen, which are 4 calories per gram. And then proteins are only 4 calories per gram also, just like the carbohydrates. So you can see that we're getting more than twice as much energy out of that same storage form of 1 gram. They also provide a lot of the energy for our body work. It is important to remember that carbohydrates are the dramatic source of fuel for our body, and we have to have carbohydrates for our muscles and our brain to work. But over time, for a prolonged activity session, fats become critical. And we start to burn more fats as we exercise longer. About 20 minutes after we've started an exercise bout, do we make that shift in the type of fuel we're using. They also help us to store fat-soluble vitamins. And if you think about the sources of different vitamins, they are an important carrier, that fat molecule. So we have the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. Then we want to talk about essential fatty acids. So there are 2 of these, and we're going to talk about them in a few minutes. But just keep in mind that essentiality, that term in nutrition, means that it's required for health, but also that we have to get it from the diet. Our body can't make it for ourselves. And I have a picture on the slide of a trusty steed and the horseman. And I wanted to kind of remind you here that fat provides a cushion, so that if we fall, we're going to bounce a little bit if we have a little bit more fat mass. It's also important for us to help regulate body temperature. And you can see this with someone who's very thin. Sometimes they have a hard time maintaining warmth in the winter, especially in the cold New England climate. They have to wear a lot more sweaters. We see this happening sometimes with older folks because they just are naturally losing some of their fat mass as they age. Also cell membranes. So if you've taken biology, you might recall that cell membranes are made of phospholipids, which is a particular type of lipid. It's found in our bodies, but also in the foods we eat. And we'll talk about that one in a little bit more detail as well. So not only are fats important in our body and do all of those things that I mentioned, but they're important in foods. So we see that the fat in the food that we eat provides a lot of energy density. And again, it's that caloric value from those fat molecules. And people tend to like high-fat foods. So think about the foods that sometimes you crave. They might be fried foods or rich, creamy desserts, things like this. Those foods have a particular level of satiety that they provide to us. As well, it's something we call mouthfeel. So if you think about, maybe you've had a non-fat cookie. You can buy those in the cookie aisle, and they tend to have kind of a cardboard texture. People don't really like those foods very often. So fat really gives food a nice creamy texture. And another great example of that is dark chocolate compared to milk chocolate. And you'll notice that the milk chocolate is very smooth and melts quickly. And the difference there between those chocolates is really the amount of milk fat found in them. After people have eaten a high-fat meal, or even an appropriate amount of fat in a meal, doesn't necessarily have to be a whole bunch of fried foods, they tend to feel satisfied in a way that they may not after eating something that is devoid of fat. So if you were to have just a whole bunch of vegetables that don't have any fat, people tend to report a feeling of fullness that's different between those 2 meals. So now that we understand why lipids are important in terms of our body and the different functions they provide, we also want to look at the different classes of lipids and break down this whole category. So we want to look at triglycerides. And this is all in the notes from the chapter, so I'm just going to review it kind of quickly. We have triglycerides, and 95% of all the lipids in your diet are in this particular form. As well, it's the primary storage form found in the human body and in other animals as well. Then we have another class called phospholipids. And these are found and very, very helpful in different kinds of foods. An example of one of these phospholipids is something called lecithin. And you might see this on a food label. Very often it's made out of a soy-based product. And then we have sterols. And here, you might kind of be familiar with this ending of sterol because you've probably heard of cholesterol. And that's really the most famous of these sterols. They have a particular shape, and we're going to talk about that as well. When we look at these different fats, we're going to spend some time looking at whether or not they're saturated or unsaturated. And this is, again, probably something that you've heard talking about different kinds of foods and health and choices that you might make. Saturated fats have particular actions in the body, and these are often found in a solid form. So these are, maybe it's in dairy products, or it could be in meat. So if you pick up a piece of steak and you notice all the ring of white around the steak, or the nice white marbling, that's all fat, and it's saturated fat primarily. What this means on a chemical level, if we look at a saturated fat, this is a fatty acid. And fatty acids are simply long chains of carbohydrates. They can be in varying lengths. That isn't really too important for our conversation now. But off of each one of these carbons, there's a hydrogen. So when we see a saturated fat, it means every single one of these carbons, that space where hydrogen can be present, is present. So it's completely filled in. This is a little different from a monounsaturated fat. What we see here is that in this fatty acid, we have a single double bond. And that means that there's a change here in our capacity to hold those hydrogen molecules. In nutrition, this becomes important because when we look at a monounsaturated or a polyunsaturated, which in this case a polyunsaturated has 2 points where there are double bonds, it could also have more than 2 points. So we often characterize a polyunsaturated as 2 or more double bonds. The reason these are important is that they're very often oils. So if you think about something like canola oil or olive oil, they're primarily made of mono and polyunsaturated. Now keep in mind that any oil is not 100% pure, or any fat. So you could have a saturated fat that looks like this. It could be butter or lard or something like this. It's not only going to contain saturated fat, it's also going to have some mono and often some polyunsaturated fats. So it's not 100% pure. Just like olive oil, which we often think is a very, very healthy choice, is not 100% poly or monounsaturated. It's a mix. It's a blend. And that's an important distinction that we'll take a look at in a few minutes. So now I want to kind of explain what this triglyceride structure is all about and why it's important. We're going to see when we look at digestion of fats that this is all going to come into focus a little bit more. For now, what I'd like you to appreciate is that a triglyceride, and that name should you can kind of start to decipher it a little bit. So we have tri, meaning 3, and then that glyceride, you might recall or see a little bit of similarity there in that beginning of that word with carbohydrate, with glycerin or glucose, and it's in the same family. So we see this glycerol as being a carbohydrate, and we call this the glycerol backbone. This is really the structure that's going to hold our fatty acids. And we said that it was a triglyceride, so it has 3 fatty acids here. And I invite you to appreciate that these are different lengths, which is fine. They can be saturated, unsaturated, or a mix of the two. That really isn't too important for us right now. That'll be something that it comes into play later when we look at its implications for health. So if we put these 2 components together, our glycerol backbone and our 3 fatty acids, we see that we have this triglyceride form. Okay? And this is, like I said earlier, the vast majority of the form we find in food, and also it's a storage form in the human body. Now this is a little bit different than what we call a phospholipid. And there's one significant structural difference here. So we're taking that triglyceride form that we had with the glycerol and the 3 fatty acids, and we're going to be replacing one of those fatty acids with a phosphate group. This is important in a process called emulsification. So I mentioned earlier that a phospholipid you might be familiar with is something called lecithin. This is found in things like egg yolks, or it's found in soybeans, also in peanuts. What this particular component, this phosphate group, allows in this emulsification process is that it's a bridge between the fat and water. And normally, if you think about, maybe you've had a salad dressing, you go down the aisle and you notice that all of those bottles of salad dressing have a whole bunch of water or vinegar on the bottom and then the oils on the top. They naturally want to separate because fat molecules are something called hydrophobic. They're scared of the water, so they don't mix. And I can take that salad dressing and I can shake it, and it's not going to stay blended for very long. They're just going to separate naturally. If instead in that salad dressing I put one of these phospholipids, like an egg yolk or some other kind of an emulsifier, what's going to happen is that that phosphate group is going to be able to attach to one of the water groups. So I will no longer see that layer of oil on the top. It's going to be able to kind of suspend the fat within that watery mix of vinegar and water. So this is important in food, but it's also important in digestion. Because in our stomach or in our intestines, we don't want there to be a layer of fat. We want that fat to be suspended within all of that food environment so that we're able to absorb and digest that a little more easily. So we're going to take a look at that in the digestive process. Okay? So I want you to be familiar with this emulsification process so that we can talk about that later. Now our third class of lipids that we haven't talked about are sterols. In sterols, I invite you to really appreciate the structural form here. So when we looked at the triglyceride and the phospholipid, we saw this very orderly backbone and three components, either the 3 fatty acids or 2 fatty acids and a phosphate. What we see here is dramatically different, and it's quite elegant, really. You can appreciate it's got this honeycomb structure to it. It's a cyclic structure, and this is quite chunky, really, if you look at this molecule. Where we see sterols, I've already mentioned that cholesterol is one that we're very familiar with. We also see them as sex hormones and vitamin D. I have that here. It's this particular type of molecule. You'll see these being important for health. You'll also see them in the diet to some extent. Cholesterol is important in cell membranes. So if you're at the supermarket and you're interested in finding foods that either contain cholesterol for some reason or don't contain cholesterol, there's a clear dichotomy here. Foods that have cholesterol must be animal in nature. So maybe they contain butter or lard or milk products or something like this, or they're meat. Fruits and vegetables, whole grains, do not contain cholesterol unless they're processed in some way. So you could find a loaf of bread or cookies or some other baked product that does contain cholesterol because it's coming from those dairy products or some kind of an animal-derived product. And this has really become kind of an issue in labeling of foods. So it used to be you could go to the supermarket in the produce aisle and they would have a sticker on the bananas that said cholesterol-free food. Well, that's very misleading to customers, and the USDA has really, kind of limited the ability to do that because it misled customers to thinking that bananas might naturally, have a little bit of cholesterol and now they're specialized in some way. It was just a marketing ploy. And we're going to talk also about the fact that seeking out cholesterol-free foods is not necessarily that important for health. This is a misconception that a lot of people have. So now that we understand these 3 classes of lipids, and we understand the saturated fats and unsaturated fats, keep in mind I had mentioned that fats are not pure, or oils. So if we look at this chart, we can really gain an understanding of the complexity of different kinds of fats or oils that we might choose in our diet. Generally, looking at this chart, the ones that are red are foods that we might avoid or limit to some extent. So things like coconut oil, although there's a lot of recent interest in this product, and it might prove to be very healthy, the jury is really still out here. We have to keep in mind that it's a highly saturated fat, and that's why it tends to be kind of solid or a little bit more solid at room temperature. So if you buy a can of coconut milk, you might notice that there's a layer of fat at the top, and that's that solid saturated fat. We can look at butter, we can look at lard or beef fat, things like this. These are highly saturated, but they also contain some amount of the mono and polyunsaturated fats. Generally, for better health, we are advising people to seek out fats that are more in this green and blue area, where it has limited saturated fat. So if you're using olive oil, that's a really excellent choice. So is canola or some of these other oils that we might choose. But just keep in mind that it's a little bit more complex than that, and it's fine. We don't want people to go on a fat-free diet. That isn't a healthy choice. So now we're going to shift gears again and look at digestion of fats. In carbohydrates, we talked about the opportunity for you to start digesting carbohydrates right in the mouth from that salivary amylase. Only when we're infants are we able to start breaking down milk fats in the mouth. This is something we outgrow very quickly, and it has some evolutionary advantages when we're infants and we're living on milk. As we age and we no longer have that ability, we see that there's limited opportunity to digest any kind of fat-containing food until it gets to the small intestines. So in our stomach, we see that there's really very little to no digestion of fats. This is kind of a holding area. And then as food moves into the small intestines, this is the site of the majority of digestion, not only of fats, but also we saw that with carbohydrates. We're also going to see that with proteins. This is an opportunity for us to draw on our knowledge of emulsification and look at how that's going to influence our ability to digest these fat products. We have here the introduction of something called bile. And bile is made by the liver. You might be familiar with that. And it's stored in something called the gallbladder, which is a small organ. Sometimes it goes wrong for people and they have it removed, which is not really a problem. They're still able to digest fats. The advantage of having your gallbladder is that that bile is stored right there, and it's an on-demand system. So when the sensors in the small intestines detect that there's fat, there's a muscle contraction of the gallbladder and it sends the bile into the small intestines. It's really a digestive aid. It's not an enzyme. It's made of cholesterol. And we talked about this when we had a conversation about the benefits of fiber in that enterohepatic recycling system. So we already know that it's made of cholesterol. And the idea here is that that cholesterol is able to bind with not only the fats in our digestion, but also with the water, that aqueous environment. And it enables enzymes then to come along and bind to the fat to help us break it down. So I invite you to really appreciate the picture I have here. It's kind of small, but if you look at this molecule or globule of fat, and we know that fat tends to like to stick together. It's something called lipophilic. So there's a new vocabulary word for you. It's basically fat-loving, and they want to all stay together in a nice little tight group. The bile comes along, and it's going to help to separate these individual little globules of fat. And you see it breaks that down and it surrounds it. It's kind of like it's a little army. Then it comes along then, and it's going to isolate lots of these small pieces of the fat molecule. This really sets the stage then for the enzymes to come along and bind to the fat. So another way to look at this, here we have enzymes. These can be pancreatic enzymes that are produced just to help us digest lipids. So these are lipase enzymes. So that ending ASE is going to help you remember that it's an enzyme. And here there would be basically a profile of our small intestines, and we have this watery or aqueous environment, and the fat likes to stay all together, right? We talked about that concept that it's going to stick together in this lipophilic mechanism. What's going to happen when we have the introduction of bile? And this is just another picture. Before it was a little green line, so now we have it in a slightly larger detail. That bile is going to come along and it's going to grab some of that fat and start to isolate it. And it's going to remove it from the large group. By having this particular form, which we call a micelle, then we can complex that micelle with our enzymes that were already present. This is really what enables us to digest fat. And if you think about if we didn't have that bile, what would happen is that the fat would stay isolated here. It would be very, very difficult for these enzymes to come and cleave a little piece of that lipid off to then break down and create energy. And it would take, not only would it be difficult, it would take a long time. So this is really going to speed up digestion. It's really a digestive aid. So keep in mind that the bile, which is made of cholesterol, does not digest the lipids, okay? It's not an enzyme, it's a digestive aid. So we just want to make sure we're pretty clear on how that works. From there, what we see happening is that those lipids are going to be broken down into smaller pieces. So if you think back to a minute ago when I was talking about those long chains of carbons in the fatty acid, what we want to do is start to break those down and have discrete little pieces of the fat that then are much easier for our body to move through the epithelial layer of the small intestines and on into circulation and make it really available to our cells and to different tissues that need those products. So I invite you to really spend a little bit of time getting familiar with this process. I'm going to present it to you very simply, very science-light, so you can feel comfortable with the process. From the intestines, when these fats are broken down, we're going to start creating other molecules that aid in our ability to transport fats around the body. This starts in the small intestines. So we see that as these different fatty acids and these triglycerides are broken down, they're going to be in different sized pieces. So we have shorter products of lipid digestion. And these shorter ones are much easier for your body to kind of deal with and move around. The larger ones are really kind of chunky, and it makes it challenging for them to go into the bloodstream or to be handled in a way that's very efficient. So I want to take you through this process, and we're going to look at what happens in digestion. So we have a nice close-up here of the small intestines. So we've taken this little chunk where all of this digestive process is happening, and we've blown it up. And if you like some trivia, I really love trivia around nutrition and human bodies. If we took this coating here of the small intestine, which has all of these ribbons, and it's very, very detailed. There's quite a bit of topography here. We stretched this all out and laid it flat. It would be the size of a tennis court. That's really important when we think about our ability to digest food and to absorb the nutrients from it. So it's this, significant advantage to us. And so if we were to take one of these little cross sections, this topography that I mentioned, and blow it up and look at it, we have all of these finger-like projections that increase the surface area in the small intestines. So this area here that's white is kind of the inside of the small intestines. And then we have this epithelial area, which is the lining. There's digestive activity happening here and also on the surface of these cells. As these different triglycerides and these fatty acids get broken down, we see that what's going to happen is that these cells here in the lining are going to transport or bring them in. So they're going to move into the cell. If they're small, it's quite easy to do that. Sometimes you'll see little fragments of lipids. Sometimes you could see a whole fatty acid if it's quite short and small. So there are different sizes. They come in, and the small ones can go right into the bloodstream. No problem. They're very easy to move around and transport. The problem emerges when we start to see these larger fatty acids. Those have to be handled very differently. So if you look at the larger ones here, these are much chunkier, they're difficult to move around. They can still make their way through the epithelial layer, but instead of going into the bloodstream, we have to treat them a little differently. They're actually going to pick up what we call a protein carrier. And they're going to get attached there. And the first one that we see emerging in the digestive process is called a chylomicron. And that's a pretty unfamiliar word, I'm sure, for a lot of you. But what I want you to really gain from this is the process. That name chylomicron, that's important when we talk about nutrition biochemistry and advanced processes of digestion. For our purposes, what's critical to understand is that we have this protein carrier. So the fats attached to the protein. And because they're attached to the protein, I can move them around the body more easily. Instead of going right into the blood, though, these chylomicrons then are going to make their way into the lymph tissue. And this is like a secondary circulatory system in your body. We often think about blood being circulated around the body, but we also have this network of lymph, which is part of the immune system. It keeps us healthy in different ways. And if you think about maybe you've had a cold and you feel the glands in your neck and your lymph nodes are swollen, it's part of that immune system. So from here, these chylomicrons go into the lymph, and then from the lymph, they're going to go into the blood. So now we've talked about the small molecules and how those go into the blood, and then the larger ones go into the lymph and then into the blood. So we have two different processes for getting those particular products of lipid digestion into circulation and then around our body for usage. I mentioned the chylomicrons, and those are a class we call lipoprotein. There are other types of lipoproteins. The chylomicron is the first one in our digestive system around fats that becomes important. And there are several iterations of this, or several types in this pathway. What becomes really important for health are the end products. So we see two types of these lipoproteins. We generally refer to them as cholesterol. So if you go to the doctor and you have a physical and they do some blood work, they might tell you your cholesterol level. So this is where we see the implications of the fats we've eaten referring to health, especially disease risk and heart disease risk. So now I want to talk about these two types of lipoproteins, or cholesterol as we commonly refer to them. You might be familiar with LDL cholesterol. This is one that we hear about, as well as HDL. And the low density, or the LDL, is considered the more dangerous one. This is the one we really want to limit. So when your doctor talks to you about your cholesterol levels, he or she is going to be most interested probably in talking about the LDL level. All right. We also want to look at HDL. HDL is considered the healthier type. And if you see, I've got the little angel wings and the little devil pitchfork here to help remind you. One good mnemonic that you might use is the H, healthy, and the L, less healthy, if that's a way to help you remember it. We have specific levels that we're looking at for these in the body. But what becomes important, aside from these levels, is the process, what these do in our body. So the LDL cholesterol has a particular job, and it is going to deliver the different kinds of cholesterol and fat products to the tissues. So you can think about it as a dump truck. I like that metaphor. So the dump truck, as it leaves your liver, because these are produced by the liver, that dump truck is all full of cholesterol and fat, and it goes around and drops it off at the tissues. And it's a lazy dump truck. At some point, it just starts indiscriminately dropping off these fat products, whether or not the cells want them. And that leads to the buildup of cholesterol in tissues, which has dramatic implications for the health of our blood vessels and atherosclerosis and other kinds of processes related to heart disease. Now, the HDL is also a dump truck, but it leaves the liver empty, which is an opportunity for it to move around the body and scavenge or pick up all of those extra fat molecules that aren't needed by the tissues. So in that way, it's doing the opposite job, and it's considered healthy because its job is to pick up all the products that would normally accumulate and perhaps cause different kinds of buildups that can impede blood flow or heart function. I mentioned that there are certain levels that your doctor is probably looking for you to have with your serum cholesterol levels. So when we see these, there's a couple of numbers to keep in mind. Total cholesterol, that number should be 200 milligrams per deciliter or less. Okay? So if you're at 200, that's pretty good. If you're at 250, there's room for improvement. And there are different ways that we're going to talk about for you to bring down that total cholesterol number. Now, just knowing that one number is not enough. We also want to break it down and understand our levels of LDL and HDL. So the LDL, we're looking for that number to be 100 milligrams per deciliter or less. Okay? And the HDL, I put that in a range here. It could be 40 to 60, 45 to 55. It varies depending on whose information you're looking at. This number tends to be much higher in women than in men. It's just a function of being male or female. And I don't know that we completely understand the biochemistry of that difference. We want this to really be as high as possible. There is no upper limit that seems to indicate disease. Instead, it's when it's really low that we're concerned. And some doctors will even look at the ratio between these two numbers. So if a person has LDL cholesterol at 100 and their HDL is quite low, we want to do some things that can shift that balance a little bit. And then the last component that you'd want to look at on a cholesterol screening would be your triglyceride level. Now, triglyceride levels, that's an indicator of your short-term dietary status. So if you've just eaten a whole bunch of high-fat foods, a cheeseburger and some French fries or something like this, this number is going to be a little bit higher than it normally would. We're looking for 150 milligrams per deciliter in this. There are other reasons why it might be elevated. You might see it elevated in someone who is abusing alcohol. In this regard, it can be as high as the 400s. So it's just an indicator of questions to ask sometimes. Also, if that cholesterol test hasn't been fasting, if someone has recently eaten a meal, it can really skew that result a little bit. So I've mentioned that this cholesterol can build up, and part of the reason that LDL is capped at 100 milligrams per deciliter is that we don't want it to build up in tissues. Remember, it's a dump truck. It's going around just dropping off those lipid products in inappropriate places. And one of the places that it really seems to build up and cause problems for people is within blood vessels. And maybe you've heard about this. Maybe someone in your life has had a heart attack or has compromised heart health. And this is basically how this works, that these LDLs are circulating in the blood, and it's at a higher level than is considered healthy. Slowly, over time, you're going to see the deposition of these LDL particles in blood vessels, and it starts slowly over time as a person is having a diet that may not be a heart-healthy diet. It may be an atherogenic diet, meaning that it's going to promote heart disease. So over time, that cholesterol starts to build up, and it gets more and more in a larger deposit. And if you look at this last little cross-section, you can see where you have the development of what we call a plaque. And this is basically just a large mass of the cholesterol. It has other products in it as well, different kinds of immune cells and platelets and things like this. But what's important to keep in mind here is that if you look at the lumen of this blood vessel, or the cross-section, because it's kind of like a pipe, you'll see that the blood flow is going to be dramatically decreased. And this is where people get into trouble, because that blood is not able to flow through this blood vessel very well. Additionally, if someone were to have high blood pressure or something like this, or even just normal blood pressure, this plaque becomes very brittle, very susceptible to breakage or damage, and so it can break off and then flow downstream and cause a blockage in the blood vessel. So these are some of the reasons we really want people to be careful of their LDL cholesterol level, and doctors will really try to help people understand how to bring that down. In addition to dietary factors that increase your risk of heart disease, there are also some that are just who you are. And they're very difficult, well, really they're impossible to change. We can't turn back the hands of time. As we increase in age, our risk of heart disease and some of these other unfortunate events goes up. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen as we age, but we know that the risk increases. Also, being male is going to increase your risk of heart disease. So women have a slightly lower risk. And if you have a family history where someone maybe has had an early heart attack or premature death, that might be something to pay attention to, because it does increase your risk, because we see a genetic component there. Now, there are risk factors that you can adjust, or you can get some traction toward heart health. So we want people to really be aware of those numbers, bringing down that LDL and increasing HDL. So when we see folks that are in this range outside of normal guidelines, it's a little clue that there's things to do. Also, high blood pressure is a risk factor for those reasons I mentioned earlier, with the formation of different kinds of deposits. People that have other chronic diseases or comorbidities, we call them, and diabetes is a big one. We see that diabetes can impact the way that blood flows around the body. And there's an interaction between different chronic diseases. So if someone is diabetic or has a diabetic condition, we see that that can increase their risk of heart disease. As well, being at a high BMI or being obese can be a risk factor. This can be somewhat mitigated depending on other factors in the person's life. But we know overall that obesity is going to increase risk. And kind of, related to that is physical inactivity. So people that are leading a highly sedentary life are going to increase their risk of heart health. Keep in mind that your heart is a muscle, and we need to exercise that muscle. So when we're engaged in cardiovascular exercise, it's an opportunity to work out our heart muscle. And then one more that I just want to mention is cigarette smoking. And maybe you've seen some of the recent campaigns talking about stroke and heart disease and their relationship to smoking. So, we want to really help people who are smoking quit because this can dramatically influence heart health, and especially if it is combined with some of these other risk factors. So increasing age, gender, family history, as well as some of the modifiable risk factors. I've already talked about the term atherogenic diet, and that might be a new word for you. But all I'm talking about there is a diet that promotes heart disease. So we can think about what that diet might look like. It might be high in saturated fat, trans fats, which we haven't talked about but will in just a moment. Also, it's going to be low in fruits and vegetables, high in processed foods, and really devoid of a lot of nutritional value. It could also include more alcohol than recommended. Early on, I mentioned essential fatty acids, and I reminded you that essentiality in nutrition refers to our need to get those particular components, whether they're vitamins or fatty acids, from the diet. It means that we can't make them in the body. When we talk about lipids and the essential fatty acids, there are two that are really important. So you've probably heard of these. You maybe have heard of omega-6, but probably you've heard of omega-3, because this is one that we're really concentrating on and we want people to understand a little bit more. So we have omega-6s in the diet in a plentiful supply. And it's okay to just know this as omega-6. You don't need to know that it's linoleic acid, although you might want to know that term at some point. These are found in oils, so you could find them in things like canola oil, olive oil, oils that we're commonly consuming in the US diet. They're also present in nuts, and they can be in whether it's walnuts or almonds. That doesn't really matter as much. And surprisingly, I think, to a lot of people, because we don't think of vegetables as being a fat-rich food, but they're also found in vegetables. You can find these things in olives or in avocados. Keep in mind that those two foods are considered fats. In terms of food groupings, they're not considered vegetables. Then we can look at linoleic acid, and this is our omega-3. Now, there's a lot of conversation around omega-3s, and there are different types. So I really want you to keep that in mind, because we talk about omega-3s as coming from fish, and I have a nice picture of fish here behind me to remind you, but they're also present in other foods. The ones that we're concerned about most that are found in fish are EPA and DHA. And so you'll see conversations around these two types of omega-3s. Now, if you don't eat fish, don't care for it, or you're vegetarian or a vegan, that doesn't mean that you don't have an opportunity to get the omega-3s in your diet. It may mean that you have difficulty getting these two types. You can also find these omega-3s in other kinds of products that are completely appropriate for vegetarian diets. They're in walnuts. You can get a lot of omega-3s in walnuts. It's a very rich source. You can also get it in flaxseed. So kind of keep in mind those other opportunities to get the omega-3s. Now, I also, a few minutes ago, mentioned that for an atherogenic diet, we're concerned about saturated fat intake, but we're also really concerned about trans fats. Another word for trans fats are partially hydrogenated fatty acids. This process of hydrogenation is really just adding hydrogens to our fatty acid chain. So there are reasons why food manufacturers want to do this, and one of the most important is that it's going to reduce opportunities for spoilage. So if you think about some of these fats and where they're used, you'll see that they're used in cakes and cookies and things like that that have a tremendously long shelf life. Also, they're very good at tolerating high temperature. So normally unsaturated fats are unstable. So if you think about olive oil in particular, if you were to put that into a frying pan, you have to be very careful about the heat that you're going to apply because it has a low smoke point. It's very vulnerable at high temperatures. When we have a trans fat, it's something that you can bring to a tremendously high heat and it doesn't degrade. And in that way, we're able to fry foods in it and do all kinds of things that normally wouldn't be possible with an unsaturated fat, or a monounsaturated fat or a polyunsaturated. So in chemistry, this looks a very certain way, and this is going to help you understand where we get that term trans fat. So I've got a big picture here of an unsaturated fat. And you can see that it's bent. It's in this particular kind of angled shape. We call this a cis formation. And that isn't really that important. We know that whenever there's a double bond in a fatty acid, it's going to change the shape of the fatty acid. And we saw this earlier when we looked at unsaturated and saturated fats. In this bent shape, it's going to remain liquid at room temperature. Because a saturated fat that's a nice straight line stacks up. So if you think about something like butter or lard, it stays solid at room temperature because of how closely we can pack all those fatty acids. With the unsaturated fats, especially when we get into the polyunsaturated, which are found in, let's say, fish and fish oils, those are very, very liquid. So even at cold temperature, so if we put olive oil in the refrigerator, it never becomes solid. It might get sludgy and a little bit thicker, but it's never going to become completely solid like butter. So then we can apply that same concept to fish. And they have those really highly unsaturated, polyunsaturated fats. It allows them to tolerate cold temperatures, like up in the Arctic Circle and places like this. So now I want to talk a little bit about what's happening with food manufacturers and how they have this opportunity to take an unsaturated fat and make it into something that looks like a saturated fat, and it's what we call a trans fat or a partially hydrogenated fat. Really, it's a conformational shift or a change in the presentation of the fat. So we have one that is bent. So here's an unsaturated fat, and you can see they've got some little hydrogens dancing around it. That's the hydrogenation process. What they're going to do is they're going to add some of these hydrogens to that double bond area. And you can see that here. And when they do that, those hydrogens force there to be a change in the presentation of the carbons in the fat. So no longer does it have that cis formation or that bend in it. Instead, it's going to lay out nice and flat. So we see that trans fats act more like a saturated fat. They can be stacked up very nicely. Years ago, when you looked at trans fats, they were really ubiquitous in our food supply. Since then, things have changed. But one of the places that people were consuming a tremendous amount of this type of fat was in products like margarine and solid shortenings. Now, there's been a lot of change around that because we understand that trans fats are incredibly bad for heart health. So a lot of those products are now trans fat free. You may still be able to go to the supermarket and find some of them that have trans fats, but by and large, they've been removed. Not completely, though. There are still products that have trans fats, and it's something you really have to seek out and you have to pay attention. Food manufacturers understand that the public doesn't want trans fats, but they're still wanting to use them because they're cheap and they extend shelf life. So there's a lot of incentive for the food manufacturers to use them. You have to be careful. You have to read labels here. And we really want people to avoid them. Just a quick story about this. In 2006, the government changed food labeling laws. So it requires food manufacturers to include trans fats on the label. There's a little caveat there, though, because you can imagine the food lobby was very strong and they didn't really want this labeling change because they thought it would reduce consumer acceptability of their products. So during that time in 2006, you saw this shift where food manufacturers were purposely hiding trans fats to some extent. Some labels will tell you right out flat, here are the trans fats. In other cases, food manufacturers have changed serving sizes because if there's less than half a gram of trans fat, they don't have to report it. They can round it down to 0, which is really shifty, right? Because I could pick up a product and I could look at it, it says, oh, 0 trans fats. That's not the end of the story. You need to do a little investigation. Then flip it over and look at the ingredients. If you see hydrogenated fats or partially hydrogenated fats, put that product back on the shelf. Okay? It is not necessarily a product you want to consume. There are 2 places that trans fats naturally occur. They're going to be found in small amounts in beef, and so it's naturally occurring there, and then also in milk products. So if you had a glass of whole milk, an 8-ounce glass, that would have about half a gram of trans fat. We are not as concerned about that. We are really concerned about the amount that's being added to our food supply. And the FDA has said that trans fat is not safe for you, and there's no level that's safe, okay? Yet it's still in our food supply. So it really is incumbent upon the consumer to do this investigation, to read the food labels, understand the foods that might contain them. Now, not every food has a food label, right? You go out to eat and you want to splurge, you want to have some fried foods. You need to ask the server. And it's really tricky because a lot of wait staff and servers don't necessarily know. It might require making a different choice until you know that it's not trans fat containing foods. I was at a coffee shop the other day and the ladies actually knew, and it was nice because they were able to say, yes, our pastries do have trans fats in them. They're made with margarine. I made a different choice there. Okay, so I invite you to do that as well. And there's a lot of reasons why you want to avoid these trans fats. So I'm going to talk about a few of them to help you kind of understand why you need to avoid them and give you power around this particular topic of trans fats. So one of the things is that they're an unnatural shape, okay, because this is made in a laboratory. I told you they're naturally occurring in beef and milk, and that isn't what we're primarily worried about in nutrition. We're worried about the ones made in laboratories. Okay, so it's an unusual shape. They're not really tolerated well by your body because it's a relatively new food product. I think the first trans fats were actually produced about 1910. They didn't become, really widely rolled out in our food supply really until the 1950s. You started to see an infiltration, and then definitely in the 70s and 80s. And then in the 90s, we started to wise up a little bit. They're not made in the body, but I will say that if you have a diet that is high in trans fats and you're breastfeeding, those trans fats will cross into the breast milk and then be given to the infant. So it's just something to consider. We've talked about how they're only found in a few places and that they affect health. So how do they affect health? Well, it's a double whammy. I'll tell you right off. They raise the bad cholesterol. So we really want to control our LDL. We're doing really well, but the trans fats undermine our efforts. They're going to bring up that LDL, and then if that isn't bad enough, they lower the HDL. So that's two terrible things that they're doing right there for you. They're also irritating, because I said that these aren't naturally found in the body and not naturally found in nature. They're something that's made in laboratories. So they produce inflammation, and we can track this in the body. There are different biomarkers, different kinds of molecules we can look for. And inflammation is part of that whole process around heart disease. So again, that's something we really want to kind of avoid if we can. When they're metabolized or broken down, and our body can break these down, the whole process of breaking down lipids is called beta oxidation. We can do that to saturated or unsaturated or to trans fats. But the problem comes in when we look at the byproducts of that metabolism. And one of them is free radicals. So you've probably heard of antioxidants. The whole idea of an antioxidant is to reduce these free radicals and take away their power to damage cells. So when we're metabolizing these trans fats, they're producing more free radicals. So again, we've undermined heart health in 4 different ways by having these in our diet. We have to be very careful of how much we're going to have. And consider that if we look at that food label and it reports 0 trans fat, but it really has about half a gram, and I have a couple servings of that food every day for a couple of weeks, I could be getting a significant amount of trans fats. So it's really something that's best avoided. Which brings us to a conversation. We've already said that there's no safe level, but how much fat should we have in general? So we have some recommendations overall around fat. With carbohydrates, I mentioned that our dietary composition, so if we're on a 2,000 calorie diet, 45 to 65% of those calories should be coming from carbohydrates. With fat, we want about 20 to 35% of our calories coming from fat. Okay? Now, a lot of people will be interested in a fat-free diet, and this was in vogue probably in the 1980s. We saw kind of hit a high point where people thought no fat was the way to reduce heart disease risk. Not true. Now I invite you to go back and think about our introduction to nutrition. We talked about 6 classes of nutrients. We talked about the 3 energy nutrients and then 3 other ones, the vitamins, minerals, and water. So if we have a fat-free diet, we are cutting out one of those essential nutrient groups. So we can't do that. So we have to learn how to use it wisely, use those lipids and incorporate them into our diet. We have specific recommendations about the amount of different kinds of fats. So with saturated fat, we want it to be 10% or less of calories. There's also another way to think about this is you get about 20 grams of saturated fat in your diet a day as an allowance, okay? It's like a budget, and you want to spend it very carefully. With trans fats, I said there's no safe level, and that's absolutely true. We want that to be under 1% or just 0. That can be tricky to avoid and to work towards that goal, but it's something to consider doing and talking to your friends about. When we have opportunities to make a shift in our diet, instead of choosing butter or saturated fat, to maybe choose an unsaturated fat. That can be a good way to help bring down our overall intake of saturated fat. So when I was talking about your allowance of saturated fats, I said that you get 20 grams a day. That's based on a 2,000 calorie diet. When we look at the unsaturated fat, you get 45 grams of unsaturated fat. So that's a grand total of 65 grams in a 2,000 calorie diet. Now I'll tell you, not too many people in the US are actually consuming a 2,000 calorie diet, even if we should be, and that's a problem sometimes. So if you are consuming a diet that is much greater in energy, you have a more generous allowance. The average caloric intake for an American adult is about 3,300 calories, which might be an indication of why we're having trouble controlling body weight. So the goal for a lot of Americans really is to stay within your energy requirement or your energy allowance, and then staying within your fat allowance. Many diets routinely go over the 65 grams of fat overall, and then within that 20-gram allowance for saturated fat, we see people going over that double, triple, quadruple in a day. It depends on what they're eating. So we have to make some shifts and look at the types of lipids we're consuming and where we're finding those in different foods. So fats in the diet overall, we have to remember they're necessary for health, and that people who reduce fats entirely, going for that fat-free diet, it's not healthy. That's not a good choice. And instead, what we want to do is we want to make sure that most adults are at a kind of minimum getting about 20% of their calories from fat. A few lessons I want to kind of leave you with after our conversation about fats is that we want to be able to recognize fats in food. And this is not really that difficult. We talked about where saturated fats are found in dairy products, in meat, in cheeses, things like this. You can also find them in smaller amounts as part of other types of lipids and fats. So we know that there's a little bit of saturated fat in olive oil and things like that. So it's added motivation to just keep track of fat intake in general. We also want to distinguish between good and bad fats. And sometimes I'll hear people say, you know, I'm being very careful about my fats. I'm trying to even have a lower fat diet because I'm trying to lose weight. But occasionally I splurge and have a big piece of chocolate cake with ice cream, or I'll go out and have an enormous steak and, you know, French fries or mashed potatoes, these kinds of things. That can be really detrimental. It's really not about the amount of fat in your diet as much as the types. So we want people to have smart fats. And by that I mean that instead of going out and having a huge meal with all of these saturated fats and even trans fats, ramp that back a little bit, okay? And know that you can have fat throughout the day. You can have that fat throughout, you know, all your different meals. One large dose of saturated fat is thought to be really something to avoid. As well, portion sizes. Now, I said, you know, people might go out and have a huge steak or something, and for a lot of people, it's hard to stay within our guidelines of an appropriate portion for steak or any kind of meat. When we're measuring it out raw, it's 4 ounces. When it's cooked, 3 ounces. And I've talked about this before, that it's the size of a deck of cards. And rarely do I see that being served in a restaurant. Okay, it is possible in some restaurants to get a 24-ounce steak. I've even seen a 48-ounce steak. That's a lot of servings of meat. Okay, so spread that out. Make most of your plate filled with fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and use meat as a condiment. Now I know that generally elicits a lot of laughter from my classes when I say that meat is a condiment. It's not the focus of your plate. You know, I don't necessarily have a vegetarian agenda here. But if you look at risk for heart disease, obesity, diabetes, it's not about the fats we're eating, it's about the amount of these fats. So if you really love to eat, we want you to have a long life filled with opportunities to enjoy these foods. So portion size and portion control is a way to do that. So that's a quick tour of fats. Some things to keep in mind are the different types. We talked about 3 classes of fats. We've talked about digestion. we've talked about chronic disease risk, especially heart disease risk, and some ways to kind of transition some of the fats in your diet to healthier choices. As well, it's important to keep track of your numbers. So those cholesterol numbers, especially the LDL and the HDL. There are different ways to increase your HDL. One of the most effective is exercise, which is going to help you meet other goals as well. Thank you.